Great, are we on? Super. So welcome. I'm Noah Horowitz. I'm Director Americas for Art Basel and oversee our show here in Miami Beach. I know many of you were with us yesterday. It's a long day, so thanks for coming so early today to be here. This is the keynote for our Conversations program. We have 19 different talks in total over the next 4 days. Art Basel is obviously a world-renowned commercial platform, but for us, as organizers, it's absolutely imperative to have this platform for discourse as well. We value this supremely. It gives our galleries, artists, curators, the entire community a lens through which to see what's happening in the halls and to better understand things. Everything that is happening both today and over the course of the coming days is recorded. You can access that on our website. We have a Vimeo page as well. There's hundreds of hours of programming over the years. When I was a student, actually, I wrote my PhD in London, and I used these talks at the time. I guess it was books that we published. We don't publish books about the talks anymore, but they are online. They're really valuable. We bring together a lot of great people. Later this afternoon, my PhD reader, Alex Albero, is presenting his new book, Abstraction in Reverse. It was just published by University of Chicago Press, so that's exciting as well. There's a lot of other amazing things. But to begin, everybody on stage, Charles Gaines is our artist keynote. I don't think he requires too much of an introduction. Legendary artist, been teaching at Cal Arts for many years now, I think since the late 80s. Charles and I just met in New Orleans. He's in the Joyner Giuffrida collection that just opened at the Ogden Museum there. So if anybody's heading to Prospect in the coming months, you should definitely make sure to see that. His work, I came in contact with a number of different contexts, but in Oakley and Weezor's Venice Biennial a few years ago, I thought his pieces were incredible. So it's really an honor, Charles, to have you here with us. Thank you so much. Bryan Stevenson is the executive director of the Equal Justice Fund. He just he was in Harvard yesterday and flew down late last night. There are a few people in the art world that I haven't yet met that I've heard more about with more praise. Bryan is one of them. I was just talking to Roland Augustine. I think he's doing an event in New York with Loring Augustine on January 10. So for those of you in New York, make sure to talk to Roland and get information about that. And Naima Keith is the Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Programs at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. A big welcome to Naima as well. Again, this is a very special moment for us. Thank you all for making the effort to come here. We have 3 great people on stage and a lot more to come. A big thank you to Mari Spirito, who's our curator of this program, who's put this all together. She works tirelessly from Istanbul and elsewhere in the world for us. She's a wonderful collaborator, a brilliant mind. Annalie Graf, who manages the program, works even more tirelessly, arguably, to bring everybody on stage here. So a warm thank you on behalf of everybody at Art Basel. Have a wonderful week and enjoy the morning.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you so much to the entire Art Basel team for organizing this conversation. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be in conversation with Charles and Bryan. Charles and I go way back. As many of you know, I was lucky enough to curate his show at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2014, which then traveled to the Hammer Museum in 2015. And while Bryan and I just met a few days ago via phone, I have been a fan of his for a very, very long time and was thrilled to hear that his memoir is being turned into a TV show, or is it a television show? A movie, excuse me, a movie. And Michael B. Jordan is going to be playing you. So it's very, very exciting. I know that was just released a few days ago, so congratulations. So we're actually going to start the conversation with a question for Charles, but really try and make it as much of an engaging and enlightening conversation between the two of you as we can. So Charles, no pressure. You have a long history with engaging with abstract systems like the grid. And while your work doesn't necessarily take, a traditional activist kind of form, there are references to political movements or to politics. How do you see your work engaging with activist movements?
Well, one thing about that, in order to address that question, you have to remember that there are two parts to my practice. The first part you referred to as working with grids and systems, and I did that from the early 70s to 89. At least that was the single focus at the time. And then from the early 90s, I worked on work that essentially based in language theory. So the work that in the second part, the work that deals with language theory was the work that more directly dealt with political work, and it didn't happen right away. That I was first interested in interrogating certain sort of assumptions about artistic practice, pretty much based upon sort of criticizing the idea or interrogating the idea of the creative imagination. And so the earliest forms that the work took, investigated that, but through that, because in doing that, I was constantly dealing with the issue of the discourse around cultural theories. I went then directly to dealing with artifacts, political texts, and political archives in my work. The question of activism, I mean, I have a general idea that like all artists are political, and all art is political. Essentially taking a sort of postmodern view of that, meaning that we're all sort of informed by ideological practices that we've learned and come into the world already engaged in certain sort of assumptions about a meaning of the world. So generally, my work is political to that extent. In terms of activists, I got to the point where when I began to work more directly with political texts, I began to feel that the work by that direct action became more activist. That I actually thought that I would sort of engage the political discourse through that work, and it really turned out to be correct, because in many times and presenting that work in different parts of the world, I would get into political arguments with people who took exception to some of the things that the work would say.
So, for example, using Malcolm X text or Black Panther text or that kind of thing, you felt that because of engaging that subject matter, that viewers start to see your work more politically engaged than maybe you even thought initially.
Well, no, it was intentional. At that point, it was intentional. The political engagement was intentional. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered was that, for example, one archival text I use is a text called Indocumentalismo, which is a text that essentially criticized the European colonization of the Americas. And people then argued with me about that. That whole history, as proposed by the archive I was working with, was wrong. And so I began to realize that, that even though I was engaged in these things as works of art, that didn't preclude the opportunity to engage political discourse and political argument, more directly, not through a maze of aesthetics or subjectivity or feelings and things like that.
Bryan, your work as a lawyer and social justice advocate is very different, obviously, than Charles's. Before we jump into a question, I think it's a great time to show your video, and then we'll jump into a question.
I love the Lord. He heard my cry. He and he pitied every groan. Long as I live and trouble rise, long as I live and I'll hasten to his throne. His throne.
So, what we just saw basically was a video about the upcoming Memorial for Peace and Justice, informally known as the National Lynching Museum. Why have you, I guess, decided to incorporate art and design into your work or into your practice?
Well, first of all, I just have to say what an incredible honor it is to be sitting next to Charles Gaines. This is like a dream come true. If nothing else good happened today, I'm good because I'm sitting here next to this extraordinary artist. You know, I've been practicing law. I believe in the rule of law. I grew up in a community where black children, I couldn't go to public schools. I started my education in a colored school. Lawyers came into the community. They implemented Brown versus Board of Education. That's the reason I got to go to high school and college and law school. And so when I finished law school, I wanted to use the law to protect the rights of people who are disfavored. And in many communities across this country, in the place where I live now, Alabama, you couldn't imagine reform or change through the political process. African Americans were a minority. They were never going to have the political power to affect basic protections of their rights. But I believe the courts could do it. It did it in Brown. It's done it throughout. I've seen in the course of my career, however, the limitations of relying on the rule of law. Our judges are shaped by the same narratives of racial difference, of white supremacy that shape everybody else. And they're tolerating bigotry and bias and discrimination in ways that they're not even conscious of how it conflicts with the commitment to equal justice under law. And so after we actually began seeing the limits, we were losing cases where black people were being systematically excluded from serving on juries, where the court was tolerating evidence of racial bias. In the death penalty context, the greatest predictor of who gets the death penalty in this country is the race of the victim. You're 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the defendant is black and the victim is white. And the court received that evidence, considered it, but nonetheless upheld Georgia's death penalty in a Supreme Court decision by concluding that if we deal with evidence of racial bias in the death penalty context, it's going to be just a matter of time before lawyers complain about these same disparities for other kinds of crimes, property crimes, felony crimes, misdemeanor crimes. And Justice Brennan ridiculed the court's analysis as, quote, a fear of too much justice, and he was right. But the second thing the court said was that these disparities are, quote, inevitable. And when the United States Supreme Court, that has equal justice under the law engraved on its building, concedes to the inevitability of bias and discrimination in the death penalty, I realized that we were going to have to take our effort outside the courtroom. We were going to have to change the narratives that have shaped the comfort level we have with racial discrimination and bias. And that's what led me to art, because we're now committed to a narrative struggle. We're not going to achieve the kind of reform we want to make if we don't change the narrative that we have inherited. And no one does a better job at narrative change than artists. That's what art is about. It's about creating a new consciousness that didn't exist before. And as you saw in the video, One of the areas where we're starting is creating a new consciousness about the legacy of slavery. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. We have 59 markers and monuments to the Confederacy. When I moved there wasn't a single word about slavery. We love talking about mid-19th century history, but we don't talk about slavery. So I think that has to change. And I think art has a way of creating change, welcoming people, and public art in particular, which is why we have a project where we're putting markers at lynching sites and slavery sites. But I believe we have to engage in a narrative struggle to kind of get past these borders and barriers. And I think art can do that. I think artists can do that. And that's what excites me about moving into this realm.
Because the question is, why a museum, right? You could have commissioned artists to do monuments. I know you're doing markers, as you mentioned, but you could have commissioned, I know you're working with Sanford Biggers and Titus Kaphar and others. You could have commissioned them to do major projects throughout the city. What kind of pushed you to say, let's do a museum?
I think we have to create a narrative, and I think that's the challenge. I don't think we have very many narrative museums in America. We have museums that are showcases for incredible art. We have some museums that do tell important stories, but narrative museums take you where you are, and they lead you through a journey, and they leave you someplace else. The Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg is an example for me of a narrative museum. The Holocaust Museum is a narrative museum. In Rwanda, the Genocide Memorial Museum is a narrative museum. It tells a story.
Right.
And for me, we have to create spaces. When I go to the Holocaust Memorial, I go through it, and at the end of it, I'm prepared to say, with so many other people, never again. And what I think we have to create in this country are spaces that tell the story of slavery and lynching and segregation and mass incarceration that compel people at the end of it to say, never again, to deepen the commitment to resistance to this bigotry and exclusion. And I think you need narrative, you need sort of a kind of constructed dialogue journey around the art, around the sculpture, to kind of make it accessible, because people have been bombarded with so many other narratives that undermine and disrupt their understanding. You know, we've got schools in Alabama that still use textbooks that don't call the Civil War, they call it the War of Northern Aggression.
Wow.
In the state of Alabama, Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday.
Wow.
Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day, we have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And against that backdrop, we're going to have to do something forceful and constructive and creative to disrupt this comfort level with this history, this view, this benign view that enslavement wasn't that bad, that lynching wasn't that big a deal, that segregation didn't leave any marks and scars.
Wow. No, I mean, obviously Alabama's been in the news a lot lately because of Roy Moore. Obviously very different than what your museum is going to achieve, but this is idea that while many men have been held accountable, I guess people are defending Roy Moore's behavior. So anyway, so it's just an interesting...
But just one quick point on that, so the state constitution in Alabama still prohibits black and white kids from going to school together.
Wow.
It's unenforceable under federal law, but it's still there. When we challenged that in the late 1990s, and the case went to the Alabama Supreme Court, it was then Chief Justice Roy Moore that ruled that challenge was invalid, that language was allowed to persist. And so we still live in a state where state constitution prohibits that. And it does say something about the state and this country that we could be electing someone who defends segregation language in the state constitution to the United States Senate.
Wow. I know Charles is being a little quiet now, but he's quite spicy on Facebook. So if you follow Charles on Facebook, he definitely will comment on everything we're saying. But I do want to get to your text-based pieces and your musical scores in particular, Charles, such as your manifestos and your librettos, that are both meant to be read and experienced live. Can you talk about the importance of physicality in your work? The idea that viewers can on one level, like I said, read the text that is scrolling, but then also have an opportunity to hear like manifestos, for example, performed live. Can you talk about, because I'm thinking about what Bryan said about going to the museum in Johannesburg, which my husband and I went to about 2 years ago, and had that same feeling, right? You walk away thinking this was a huge injustice that could never happen again. And there's kind of a physical reaction that you have when leaving the museum. And you also have a physical reaction, I think, when you're experiencing your work, Charles, in terms of just being surrounded, I think, by not only just reading the text, but also hearing that text live. So can you talk about, Charles, I guess, the importance of physicality in your work?
Well, Well, I mean, I'm interested. I've been interested in my work in sort of questioning certain received ideas about artistic practice, so in one of those is the idea of the affect that artworks produce, and I was interested in that because there's a general assumption that the work that if one produces works of art from the location of their intuition, that they're involved in a universal process. And the idea of universality here means that it's not culturally driven, that it is the same to all. And if you engage in discourse of one sort or another, and we can use the idea of political discourse here, that you're not involved in a universal process. You're involved in a localized process. So this is a framework that was going on with respect to how we've come to understand art, at least the way that art practice is taught to us. And so my work is quite early on was suspicious of that because I thought that there was a political ideology that maintained and sustained this kind of binary relationship. And so I was interested in trying to find a way to show that these ideas of affect, for example, the notion of the expressive unconscious, that these were functionally culturally driven rather than being universal. And so in my work, I deal with two aspects. One is a specifically, discourse, talking about ideas of race and gender and so forth and so on, through archive, and particularly that. But then I create a context for experiencing those ideas through affective manifestations. And what you described, what I've done was to take a political discourse, like, for example, Malcolm X Ford auditorium speech, and I translated the letters of that text into musical notation, and turned those notations into compositions, and had them performed by an ensemble and recorded. The piece itself then is experience where you read the text. In this case, let's say it's the Malcolm X speech. You read the text as it scrolls on a monitor, and you hear the music at the same time. The response I usually get is that the relationship between what you hear and what you see is sort of uncanny. That the music brings a tremendous amount of emotion to the reading of the text, and also the text scrolls very slowly, so that you have an opportunity to reread and reread and reread. And interestingly, that people find that to be a meaningful experience, that the text was not scrolling too fast or at the speed of reading. They found that to be a sort of another kind of experience of another kind or another way to experience the text. So at this point, I remind people that this text was produced by this system. All right, and so that system has no intention except to be a system. In other words, the translating the letters into notes is only intended to produce a document that way, but not intended. And I'm not talking about my overall intention. I'm talking about the intention, the idea that a system can have an intention. The system's only intention is to play itself out. However, the object that you experience has apparently great meaning to people, and so well, why does that happen? I mean, if I sort of intuited an idea and through its consummate poetry you become overwhelmed by it, then you say, well, it's because Charles is a genius. You see how he created this thing and. But if a system produces that same thing, it just confuses people how this can happen. So my point then is to say that the reason it can have meaning, even though it's arbitrarily driven, is because you bring your own cultural knowledge to the piece. And what you bring to the piece then produces the meaning, that the meaningfulness, not so much the meaning, but the meaningfulness of the piece. And so this establishes that this idea that affective experiences is part of a sort of a universal language is, I think, debunked, because in this case the system produced the object of experience, which seems to be meaningful to people, and it would not have been meaningful were not people already engaged in the various manifestations of culture. This is a way of explaining why political discourse is important, that and intrinsic to all works of art, to say that we're all framed politically, and we are given and also limited by certain political assumptions, as you so interestingly said about the judges, for one reason or another, accepting certain biases, that they're involved in this the objective dissemination of law, but they're accepting biases, and they argue that it's because of probably another level of objectivity, but it's in fact that they can't escape the constraints of their own sort of social and political limitations.
Yeah.
So there.
I knew it would come out. It's one of these. No, I mean, so this idea that the meaningfulness, also because you almost sound a little surprised, I guess, by the reaction of the audience, that they found so much meaning. Not surprised per se, but it's almost you went into it not knowing, I guess, what the audience was going to get from hearing and experiencing the text. And the idea is that the meaningfulness from experiencing the performance is coming from both the text itself, because of what text you chose, but then also what it's producing. That the people, like I said, are bringing their own kind of set of experiences to experiencing that performance, which I think is very interesting to kind of think about, Bryan, the museum, right? Because you'll be showing, slave shackles and other kind of memorabilia from slavery as well as lynching, and the idea that people are going to bring their own stories to the museum. What are your kind of thoughts about that in terms of producing meaning and attention?
Yeah. I mean, I just so appreciate what Mr. Gaines is saying about this relationship and how people bring things. I mean, we'll have artifacts, we'll have sculpture, we'll have all of that, but mostly what we're trying to do is to really create narratives. So the first thing you see are the words. There were 6,000 slave narratives produced during enslavement and in the period right after it, and most people have no familiarity with these texts. The film 12 Years a Slave is one of about 6,000 of these collected recollections and reflections. And so we've gathered a lot of that material, and we want people to read the reflections of enslaved people. We want them to hear from people who lived through slavery to shape their relationship to this reality. And what we're trying to do is to just create intimacy, proximity to the anguish. We have a very, I think, incomplete cultural record when it comes to enslavement. The visuals don't speak to the brutality of it. They don't speak to the cruelty of it. They don't actually unearth the inhumanity of it. And so that's mostly what we're trying to do. And so we have slave pens that we've created. Our building, the museum, is itself on the site of a former slave warehouse. And these pens exist, and I think when visitors see the pens, they think it's an exhibit, an artifact of that era. But when they get close enough to the pen, there will be a motion sensor that triggers a performance by an actor who will appear as a ghost of an enslaved person. They will emerge, and they will recite the words of enslaved people talking about the pain and anguish of being held in the pen. And you'll encounter these narratives from people who are desperate in chains. And then you'll see one with children, because half of enslaved people during the domestic slave trade were separated from their parents and their spouses and their children. And this separation, which was the true agony of the domestic slave trade in this country, isn't really understood until you see two children in a pen looking for their families. And then we have one pen with musicians, singers, singing this kind of music from the era, but in captivity. So the song, Lord, Why Come Me Here? How Come Me Here? Has a very different meaning in that space. This May Be the Last Time has a very different meaning in that space. And so what I'm hoping we can do is to get people closer to the inhumanity of this suffering, so that it begins to resonate in new and difficult ways. I mean, some of the quotes for me are really powerful. We have the quotes from Harriet Jacobs, who talks about, she says, selling is worse than beating. She says, I've been beaten many times, my back is always healed. They took my husband away 12 years ago, and my soul is still in suffering. You know, this idea that there are things that are worse than the physicality, the brutality, the labor, and in lifting that up. And the same is true for our lynching work. We've been going to lynching sites, we've been collecting soil. We have these exhibits where you see jars of soil collected from hundreds of lynching sites with the names of lynching victims. And it's intentional to reflect that kind of relationship we have with the burned body, the ashes in a container, except this is something you see. And we want people to have that same kind of relationship. In the memorial, which is a separate structure half mile away, the 6-foot monuments are intended to reflect the bodies of these murdered and terrified victims of terrorism. And when you enter, they're all 6 feet high. They're at eye level. You can read the names and the locations. And as you make your way through the memorial, they begin to rise. And in the second quarter, they start lifting up. And in the third quarter, you're standing underneath hundreds of figures to kind of echo that sensation, that dynamic of lifting up brutalized black bodies and putting them on display to say, white supremacy shall endure. And we want people to have that kind of relationship. And so that's the idea for me, and to introduce artists like Kwame Oboto, who's a Ghanaian sculptor who's doing an amazing work, who's going to do a slavery piece, and women. Dana King is going to do a piece about the women that made the Montgomery bus boycott come to life. And then folks like Hank Willis Thomas, who's got some powerful images around the contemporary challenges of police violence. And then we have artists in our museum, Sanford Biggers and others. So yeah, I'm really excited about how we can integrate that in a space that tells a story using art and word and music and kind of dynamism to create a new consciousness.
I know the museum will, not only will it engage slavery, but also mass incarceration.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I just think that if you understand this history differently, I do think the true evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. I think the true evil of American slavery was the ideology of white supremacy, the idea that black people were different than white people. They weren't fully evolved. They weren't this. They weren't capable. They weren't smart. They weren't all of these things. And that ideology, for me, was the true evil. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this ideology of white supremacy. And that's why I've argued that slavery doesn't end in 1865. It evolves. It turns into decades where we have lynching and violence and the terror that African Americans experienced between the end of Reconstruction and World War II was devastating, and we haven't really confronted that. The demographic geography of America was shaped by terrorism and lynching. The black people in Los Angeles and Oakland and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit didn't go there as immigrants. They went there as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And then we have segregation and this effort to legally restrain some of these forces, but it's not sufficient to overcome that narrative of racial difference. And so today, I think there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that black and brown people are burdened with in this country. And you can be a world-class artist, you can be a lawyer, you can be a art collector, you can be a donor. If you're black or brown, you will go places where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty just because of your color. And when that intersects with a criminal justice system that is as aggressive and punitive, we now have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We went from 300,000 people in jails and prisons in 1972 to 2.3 million people in jails and prisons today. So in an environment as racialized as this, where there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt, we can't see mass incarceration as disconnected from this line that goes from the genocide of Native people through enslavement of African Americans, through lynching, through the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, through segregation, to the present. And so for me, making that connection is critical if we're going to have the will to eliminate the bias and bigotry that we find so pervasive in our system. Black people are sentenced typically 6 times more harshly than white people for the same offense. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. And it's not a topic that our politicians are talking about. And so for me, making the connection to slavery is key. If people today think, if I was alive during slavery, I would have been an abolitionist. If I was alive during lynching, I would have been fighting against it. If I was alive during the civil rights struggle, I would have been marching with Dr. King. Well, you are alive during the time of mass incarceration, and the question is, what are you doing? Right? And that's the question we're trying to raise.
And how, I mean, there's so many interrelating systems, I think, that are involved in, obviously, both in terms of slavery and mass incarceration, including capitalism. Yeah. And so just, again, just to kind of keep going on the same point, how do you feel even capitalism intersects with both mass incarceration, the treatment of black bodies? Because it's such an interesting, like you said, 2.3 million people are now currently incarcerated.
Well, no, there's no question. We've created an industry now. I mean, we have private prisons that are making millions of dollars, and they are oppositional to anything that will reduce the prison population in this country. So we might all agree that it makes no sense to put somebody in prison for 50 years for simple possession of marijuana and cost taxpayers $50,000 a year to put them in prison. But if we go to a legislature and try to change that, there is an industry that is going to try to block that. So they have an economic incentive to keep the prison population high. We spent $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980. We spent $80 billion last year. And so now there are economic interests that are profiting from these high rates of incarceration. And so we have to understand that there is that kind of force, the corruptive force of money and greed pushing this forward in the same way that existed during enslavement, in the same way that existed during segregation, right? And so, yes, I think we can't be indifferent or blind or naive about these economic forces that have to be challenged if we're going to make reform.
Charles, again, I know very different, but do you see your work contending, I guess, at all with political systems of values and exchange? Again, obviously in a very different way, but I mean, do you see your work at all kind of wrestling with issues around value, exchange, capitalist systems? You could say no.
Well, yeah, not all. All of those issues are within the archive.
I need to hold the microphone to your...
I was wondering what this was for. All the work through the archives and documents it deals with all the works that raise these issues. So they're intended to be part of the experience of the work. So yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, I'm reminded that this idea of the role of capitalism, perpetuating things that are really damaging to us. It's similar to the situation with global warming, where clearly there are interests out there who are perpetuating a resistance to change and the conditions that are perpetuating global warming. They're resisting change, knowing full well that it's a dangerous thing to do. And so I'm very much interested in how this happens. I mean, similarly, how people make decisions, it's essentially based upon certain sort of affective impulses, like the Roy Moore issue. How people make decisions that. Okay. Yeah.
Come on, Bryan. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. But yeah, how people make decisions about, as in that issue where apparently he's going to be elected even though he's a pedophile, and how they can justify and argue and support that kind of idea. And so the way those things operate, the way certain kinds of oppressive strategies perpetuate themselves in the areas of racial discourse and gender and so forth, operate on almost all levels of politics, where at a certain point, there is a group of people who will reinforce and support things that are actually dangerous for them. I think that I have this theory, which it means nothing, I guess. But that I think that part of the way that works is it's based upon a sort of a fundamental fear of the dominant culture. So I'm going to name the dominant culture as essentially white people, and so white males in particular. The fear of change that seems to be pushing at the edges of society these days, that become the emotional tag that pushes them to support things that are actually not good for them. Because if in fact Moore doesn't get elected, or if we let too many, black people out of jail, then what happens is that black people will change society that we know, or if Moore is not elected, then democratic politics will change society that we know, and what that means is that they'll let a lot of black people make important decisions, and it'll change society as we know. And I really think that in the United States, that's a core reason, at least an important reason, why these kinds of crazy, things persist. One of the things that because you said you saw the Holocaust Museum and in South Africa, there's people have come to terms, there's at least some level of apartheid. And the question, it was raised, will that ever happen here? Will there be a point where slavery and racism as part of the American legacy will be recognized nationally by the country by putting these institutions that, as you said, that remind us that never again should this happen? And I was generally very pessimistic about that. I don't think that in this country that's ever going to happen. It's happened in Germany, it's happened in South Africa, until I met you.
Okay, the love fest, I love it. I don't want to. No, but I think, Charles, it might be helpful just to kind of think about, again, how your work kind of interacts with ideas around value and exchange, maybe to walk us through an example. So if there's maybe a work that maybe comes to mind for you that we could maybe discuss in a little bit more depth so people can really kind of think through or understand how you see your work kind of interacting with these systems. Is there something, because you said there are a number of works in your practice that.
Yeah, one series, it's called Librettos. I work with the Stokely Carmichael document, and in that piece, what I do is I collapse these two different archives. One is this Stokely Carmichael document. It's this first speech where he coined the term the Black Power, with an opera written by Manuel de Falla called Life is Short. And so visually what happens is that the two documents are collapsed together so that you have to, in order to experience, you have to read one, you have to experience the other, and vice versa. So you cannot access the Carmichael speech without having to work through the manuscript of the opera, and vice versa. So they have this interaction. There are two there are two documents that have nothing to do with each other in any case. But what happens is that some of the ideas that Stokely Carmichael introduces in his writing helps us rethink the libretto of the opera. Like the opera itself, deals with a love affair between a prince and the so-called gypsy, a beautiful gypsy woman, and at a certain point, the prince is reminded that he has princely duties and he has to marry another noble person, and so he had to reject this affair, except that he didn't tell the woman, and by accident she came upon the engagement ceremony. It was a big outdoor festival where the engagement was, the prince was going on. And so she, entered the space and walked up to him and said, "What's going on?" And so he said something like, "I don't know this woman. Have her removed immediately." And she was struck with such great grief that she falls dead right at his feet. So conventionally, that deals with typical operatic narrative, the tragic, and usually in the typical operatic narrative, the woman dies. It's like in the movies, the black guy gets killed first, but in the typical operatic narrative, the woman dies, and everybody goes home crying. So that was the typical way. But within the context of this Carmichael's speech, there's a new reading of that which deals with all issues of gender, race, and class that comes forward, and also certain affects related to those readings that happen. And conversely, the opera itself informs Stokely's speech. The speech itself is remarkable. The poetry of the speech is, I think, illuminated by the work. And I suggest that all of you go back and read it, because I remember, I'm old enough to remember when he gave the speech, and at the time, Carmichael's speech is very colloquially driven, and a lot of at the time, people and he did this on purpose. He's very educated, and I don't want to give the wrong meaning by saying that. But he spoke very colloquially and in black language and so forth, and people tended to dismiss him because of that. But he didn't care, because he was not talking to white people; he was talking to black people, right? And but they tended to dismiss him. And then you go back and read that now, and read that language. It's absolutely amazing and absolutely gorgeous, and it just reminds you that things change very little.
Both of you, now to kind of bring questions that I think overlap between your two practices. Both of you engage very differently, I guess, with notions of sight, or site specificity. Bryan, thinking in particular about your decision to locate the museum in Alabama, where on one level it could have been in Georgia, it could have been Louisiana, because there's still that same type of history, existing in those states as well. Can you talk about your decision to, not only do you have obviously your own roots, your own familial roots in Alabama, but why Alabama?
Well, I think that there is something authentic about these spaces, and a lot of people have said, why didn't you put this in Washington? Why didn't you put it someplace like that? I actually really think it's important that people have to come to the sites of this violence and destruction. And it's not that it's unique to Alabama, but I think there's an intensity there that's really important. Montgomery is a city that the city seal still proudly proclaims itself as, quote, the cradle of the Confederacy. And the iconography of the Confederacy and all of that resistance to integration is something you're going to have to navigate as you make your way to our space. And so in many ways, I think just as an experience, it's important. You can't truly understand the Holocaust if you go to Europe, if you're unwilling to go to Auschwitz or Birkenau or Berlin, or these sites where these horrific things happen. And in fact, in Berlin, those stones that are placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted turn those homes, those spaces, into something very different than if you just saw McDonald's and Walmart and all these kinds of institutions, which are so frequent in our landscape. And so I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is that we want to make a witness in that space that has been so resistant, that's been so intolerant of progress. I think that if we can create a narrative conversation, a debate, a change in a place like Alabama, then there's no place in America where we can't replicate that. And for me, that's important. And then the last thing for me about it is that it's just, it's a place that calls to me. My office is 100 meters from the river where tens of thousands of people were brought by boat and by rail. I'm 100 meters from one of the largest, most prominent slave auction sites in America from 1850 through the Civil War. And when I walk down to the river sometimes just to gather my thoughts, and sit there, if I sit there long enough and I think deeply enough about this history, I can almost imagine hearing things. And I sort of hear the sound of all of these trafficked black people who were paraded up Commerce Street. And I sense this kind of foreboding. And it's the kind of experience I have when I go into a jail or prison. There's a sound of desperation and despair in many of these places. And it will echo in your head until it kind of disrupts your thinking, your feeling. And I think that's actually necessary if we're going to do the kind of change that is required to confront some of these systems to create more justice in this country. So for me, it's important that you come to a place and that you create a new relationship to that place. Even Florida, we're here in Miami. Dade County had several lynchings. And if you wanted to know where the lynchings are, the government is not going to help you find a single one. There's not a single marker for the half dozen lynchings that took place in this community. The slave trading sites that took place on the coast here of South Florida have not been marked. They haven't been identified. And I think our relationship to this conversation, to this history, is changed when we create a new consciousness about that. And so that is why, for me, lifting up the importance, the power, the witness of these spaces is really critical to creating the consciousness that we need.
So then, what has it been like, I guess, to work with both the state and the city of Montgomery to erect this museum, right? Because you're kind of pointing out the fact that they're proudly kind of saying, I mean, even though you're Bryan Stevenson and you have a lot of clout, what has it been like to kind of push that envelope?
I think if I have any clout at all, it's much greater at Art Basel than it is in Montgomery, Alabama. No, we've done this as an entirely private initiative. We just didn't want anybody to prevent us from doing the things we needed to do. And to that extent, we've been successful. But I think we've had to think about it kind of as something that is independent from local government. When we tried to put up the first markers on the slave trade, I went to the Alabama Historic Commission. I said, well, how do you put up a marker here? And they said, oh, if you have truthful information, we'll put it up. So we went out, of course, being lawyers, we put together a 60-page memo on the Montgomery slave trade. It had like 140 sites and sources, and we gave it to them and said, we want to put up 4 markers. And they wrote back in writing. They said, well, your information is all historically accurate. We don't disagree with any of that, but we're not going to put up markers that talk about slavery. That would be, quote, too controversial. This was in 2013. And so we had to go out and kind of push the city to agree to let us put these markers up at our expense. And even there was resistance. People, well, who wants to read about that? And you have to sometimes take on the habits. I finally, I said to the mayor, I said, Mr. Mayor, I think you think that if you say no, that's the end of this. And if I could be out of my role as a lawyer and your advisor for just a little bit, I want to just advise you. I'm going to tell you that this guy is not going to stop just because you say no. And I predict you're going to be answering questions over the next year about why you're unwilling to put up a marker that talks about slavery, and you're going to get to the point where you're going to say, you know what, I wish I just let him put those up. So why don't we skip forward and get to that point. And now I think he has welcomed the idea that what we're doing is important to create a new consciousness. Because I think a lot of times when you talk about this history, I think people get scared. We're so unaccustomed to talking about race. We get nervous. And if you start talking about racial justice, people get anxious. We've been that kind of disrupted in our ability to think carefully about these issues. And what I want to say to people is that I'm not talking about this history because I'm interested in punishing America. This is already a too punitive society. I want to liberate us. I actually think there's something better waiting for us than this division and conflict and tension, but we can't get there if we don't tell the truth about where we've been. My clients who go up for parole, each one of them has to say, I'm sorry for the crime I committed, and they have to express their remorse. Parole boards won't let you out of prison if you're unwilling to acknowledge the wrongfulness of your crime because they don't trust you to not go back out and reoffend. And it's the same for us. If we want to make progress, we're going to have to give voice to that. And I do believe in truth and reconciliation, truth and reparation, truth and restoration. But I believe those things are sequential. You got to tell the truth first. You can't have reconciliation before truth. You got to have truth-telling first. And that's what motivates you to kind of position yourself that you can then talk through how we restore, how we recover, how we reconcile ourselves to this difficult and painful past.
I'm so inspired. I feel like I'm off the mic. No, but Charles, I think you're more engaged in the site in a very different way, obviously. On one level, with numbers and trees, for example, we're looking at a particular site over time. But then more recently, even there's Highline projects, there's creative capital, there's different things that are engaging with site. So can you talk about how you feel as if your work kind of engages with a very particular site, I guess more recently?
I don't really think of it as being conscious of sight, really. The two projects that you referred to, the Creative Times project
Creative Times, yeah.
and the Highline project, both of them, well, one of them I didn't get, so that's.
I mean,
Yeah, but the other one is in limbo right now, and they were the two pieces that specifically engaged issues of sight. I mean, as I work with documents in my gallery practice, in those instances, the site becomes treated as if it's an archival location. So it becomes comparable to the site becomes comparable to the archival document. So in one piece that one of those works that I designed called Moving Chains. It's originally designed to go on the riverfront in St. Louis, located between the river and the Saarinen Arch, and behind the Saarinen Arch is the courthouse, where the Dred Scott decisions were made. And so the piece is essentially, if I can just describe it for a moment, that it's a kind of structure that was intended to be 150 feet long and with the height of about 10 to 12 feet. On the top of the structure, there were assembled the chains, the mooring chains that were used to moor boats along the river. These chains are pretty huge. Each link is about 5-7 pounds. But so the links then are 150 feet long. Actually, they're 300 feet long because they looped, and there are 10 of them, and they were attached to motors that were attached to a pulley system. And when the motors turned on, the chains would move in the same direction of the shape of the vessel at the speed of the Mississippi River. And the structure was built so that you can go inside of it. So once you're inside, then you would be underneath the chains as they moved above you. We had to contend with the noise. We were told that to build the mechanism to make this thing work, the object would be louder than a 747. So we had to design certain buffers to sort of minimize the sound. Didn't want to eliminate the sound. The site specificity of the piece has to do. You can remember it's located in the Mississippi, which is the Saarinen Arch is a monument to the pioneering spirit of America. St. Louis was a frontier during the time of the Dred Scott decision, and so I saw the opportunity to collapse two narratives in this piece. The one having to do with the Dred Scott decisions, and the other has to do with the history of sort of the pioneering spirit or certain colonial practices that were built into American history as they continue to occupy the rest of the western frontier. So the document is supposed to engage and bring together those two narratives. I thought that it would do so by issuing up the memory of slave ships, because this, in fact, the Mississippi was used to move slaves up and down the slave then becomes a part of the history of commerce, and that history extended into the present through the continued role of the Mississippi to become it's the site where commerce is moved, so that the object that I made became a kind of vessel that you can occupy either as in terms of a slave ship or one of the what do you call them, those boats that move commerce up and down yeah, barge. Thank you. So it would absorb both of those kinds of meanings and allow then, to some kind of a sort of poetic and discursive communication between both of those experiences. The Dred Scott decision is still an amazing moment in American history. In order to prepare for the piece, we went into the archives at the courthouse. We were allowed to, and the entire history because there are 3 trials, and they all took place in this courthouse, and the entire history of the trials is in this box that's about like this. And I facetiously commented on several occasions that my divorce papers are bigger than that. So as a consequence of that, I attached another project to it, and that is to, in the spirit of the work that I've been doing with librettos and manifestos, I'm engaged in writing an opera based upon the Dred and Harriet Scott.
So I guess my last question before opening up to Q&A, I think is important to, I don't want to end on, but at least an important question to ask, because both of you are educators, and I know it plays a major role in both of your lives and your practices. Can you talk about, I guess, what role being an educator, I guess, has played in your work? I know, Charles, you teaching at CalArts for a number of years, a number of your students kind of owe their entire careers to taking your courses. And can you just talk about, again, the importance, I guess, of being not only just an educator, but someone who is kind of actively an artist, a social activist, and a teacher, kind of all at the same time?
Well, I'm interested, and in fact, this is, the educational mission of CalArts is to sort of highlight or sort of encourage art as a discursive practice rather than an aesthetic, simply an aesthetic practice. So the whole idea behind that is to have our students think about art as part of the general investigation and into the history of ideas, and art as a contributor to the history of ideas, or the history of knowledge. And so to this extent, the discourse or criticality, it's an essential factor. We use the critique seminar to do that. The critique seminar becomes a useful site for me because I have the opportunity to bring in sort of provocative ideas into the classroom that I haven't figured out myself, and I'm lucky enough to teach at an interesting institution with bright students, so that we got to sort of just experiment with these ideas, and which hopefully it gets us to think about things in new and different ways, particularly around the way we look at not only and understand art, but the way we look at and understand the world. So the classroom for me is an extension of my studio. This is another reason that education is very useful, at least for me. You get to encounter these very bright people, and some of them become major artists. And so what happens is that, if you pay attention to them, then they'll help you get shows later on.
Yeah, I have a similar relationship to the importance of it. When I was a young lawyer, I had the privilege of knowing people like Rosa Parks and Fred Gray, who Representative Dr. King were in my ear, and they were encouraging. And so for me, education is important. One, I think because we have to model careers and identities that we want other people to take up. And in law schools, at least, the dominant model is not one that says, go work in a difficult place and go do social justice work at a fraction of what you might earn someplace else. And so I do think that it's important to have some people in those spaces who witness and who model something else. I mean, I really am persuaded that you change the world to create justice, not just by the ideas in your mind. And too often our educational environments are so focused on what we put in our heads. And I want my students to have lots of information. I want them to be smart and tactical and strategic and informed. But I'm also there to remind them that you don't change the world with the ideas in your mind. You change the world when the ideas in your mind are fueled by some conviction in your heart. And I think in these environments, we need people who are prepared to talk about what has moved them, what has pushed them. I really believe to change things, you have to have people who are willing to stand up when other people say sit down, who are willing to speak when other people say be quiet. And to create a community of people who are willing to do that, you have to affirm the importance of that, the power of that. And I'm determined to be hopeful in the work that I do. I feel like I have to maintain a certain amount of hope, because I think hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I really think that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And I'm hopeful when I find young people, and we are working with many of them now, who have the same energy and the same commitment, the same desire to see things change that I have. And that for me is a very energizing process. So I do get something from it. I think like Charles, I'm there because I want to give, but I know I'm going to get back from this community of people who are so committed and so dynamic and so energetic. And it creates a bit of a circle. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of other people doing my work. And I want to do my part to make sure I can lift up new voices and new talent and new commitments to enter the space.
I just want to circle back to the fact that you said that one of your mentors was Rosa Parks. I
Yes.
just want to circle back to that fact.
Yeah,
Let me just kind of drop that and just kind of kept talking. But,
No, a very quick, when I moved to Montgomery, there was an amazing woman named Johnny Carr, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she called me up and she said, Bryan, I understand you're young lawyer that just moved to town. I said, yes. And she said, well, I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she said, if you're a lawyer that just moved to town, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen. And then she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. And she would call me up and send me places to speak and send me places to listen. And then one day she called me up. She said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming back to town. She's my dear friend. We're going to get together over at Virginia Durr's house, a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. She said, we're going to get together and talk. She said, do you want to come over and listen? I said, oh, yes, ma'am, I do. And every now and then she'd say, now, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? So I'd have to explain to her. So I went over there and I listened to Rosa Parks and Johnny Carr and Virginia Durr just talk for 2 hours, and it was the most inspiring thing because they weren't talking about the things they had done. They were talking about the things they were still going to do. There was such hopefulness in that place. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I turned to Ms. Parks and said, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement. We're trying to do something about racial bias in the criminal justice system. We're trying to help children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to help the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about poverty. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. And these beautiful older women took my hands and they said, we're going to help you be brave. And it began this relationship with these amazing people, and I owe a great deal to them. They were incredible forces in shaping my work. Yeah.
So I think we have time for about 2 or 3 questions, and then there's someone in the back. I see Ann Pasternak on the back. Oh, great.
Hi, guys. Bryan, keep telling that story. I never get tired of that story. It gives me hope. So somebody smart, I should know who it is, said something to the effect of, we know what justice looks like through the struggle. Do you know who it was? Was it you, Bryan?
I say what?
That who said something to the effect of, "We know what justice looks like through the struggle." It could have been you. Anyway,
Yes.
so somebody really great said it. And I'm just curious about your reflections of where we're at with the struggle and where you think we ought to be this time next year.
Well, I mean, I do think this is an important moment in our nation's history. I think we're having an identity crisis in this country, that there are these forces that are pushing in different directions. But I'm hopeful because I do think that when artists and great architects and designers give voice to the urgency of now, and they start talking about things like climate change, and they start talking about things like how we have to recover, when we lift those things up, I believe we can make some change. This is a moment of conflict and controversy. And as Dr. King said, this is the kind of moment where we have to measure who we are, right? And so I'm worried. I'm really worried about all of the retreat from basic commitments that many people thought we had kind of overcome and would never see again. But I'm also very hopeful. You know, when women marched in January of this year and asserted an identity that was not going to be turned around by the rhetoric of misogyny and abuse, it said something important about our capacity to do more. When people gathered in spaces to reject the violence and symbolism of Nazis and Klan people, it said something more about our capacity to do more. And we're just going to have to kind of organize all of that and make a powerful witness. And so I'm worried, I'm concerned, but I'm hopeful. And I'm determined that we can actually make change in this country despite the present climate. And sometimes it's only in conflict and controversy that we really find the voice that lifts us to move forward. And I think this is that time.
Hello. Thank you very much. Oh, am I going? Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I was interested in your comments about reading back the current period, you know, the slavery, of course, on the question of white supremacy. You know, I would want to read forward. Certainly, you know, today we're much better on the question of white supremacy than during slavery, than during Jim Crow. And I was also interested in the question that you had raised about capitalism. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah, and the really what all this brings together in my mind is neoliberalism, specifically, profound economic inequality, the billionaire class, and how white supremacy, reflective of the slave period, reflective of Jim Crow, is trying to be rekindled and indeed officially established as a way to justify, legitimize, and uphold neoliberalism. And even the prison crisis, right, can be read in that way. So I just wanted to really, you know, your thoughts got me thinking in those directions. So I don't really have a question as much as an idea that maybe you could comment on.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's about power. You know, who has power and where does power exercise itself? I think actually Charles said it most effectively when he talked about this kind of, you know, fear that you see in certain segments of the population. It's most represented by white men who are fearful about the power they're going to lose as women assert their voices in the workplace. And you see that. And a lot of this harassment and bigotry, I think, is a manifestation of that fear. And you certainly see it as we have a more demographically diverse country, right, with new voices and new faces. And so it's how we manage fear and anger, and the billionaire class, as you described them, and people with power have the capacity to do very destructive things to manage their fear and their anger. And that's why, for me, ultimately, this is about rejecting the politics of fear and anger. We have mass incarceration because we allowed ourselves to be governed by people who wanted us afraid and angry. And if you're afraid and angry, you'll tolerate inequality. You'll tolerate abuse. You'll tolerate injustice. And so for me, it's ultimately about rejecting that and insisting on something more hopeful, more inclusive. I'm not afraid to share power because I actually think that my life is enriched when more voices, more perspectives, more people can celebrate things the way I want to celebrate them. And so that's the challenge that I see. It's how we use the power and privilege that we each have in a way that's not rooted in fear and anger, but rooted in hope and transformation.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to that because I think built into your question or comment was the idea that the relationship between neoliberalism and racism, or the legacy of slavery, that in neoliberalism it finds in the legacy of slavery, or it finds in excuse me, finds in racism the opportunity to perpetuate neoliberalism. And so there's an old debate that's been going on for a long time between colonialism, the history and practice of colonialism, and we'll say racism itself. The debate is that the reason why colonial practices persevered because of economic forces, of wanting to get rich. The argument was that the reason why colonial perseveres is because of a deep belief in white superiority. The issues how are they linked, or are they separate? I'm of the school to think that they're separate. I think that that although colonial practices, it was an action that where human beings were territorialized, that the idea of the amassing property is one idea, and the idea of feeling superior is another idea, and that the history of the colonial West is really based upon a deep-rooted racism. It's not based on greed. And so I just wanted to comment that this is a long-term debate that's going on. It really goes back to Marx and whether we can explain explain racial relationships in terms of class struggle, not in terms of just racism. It's been going on a long time. It's been a long debate, and I just wanted to clarify my position on that debate.
So we have one question over here, and then back over this way, because she's had a hand up for a while. So then we'll definitely go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted. Is this on? Can you hear me? This is addressed to both of the speakers. Both of you have mentioned time and time again the centrality of the archive in your practice and in your pedagogy. And I'm struck, I'd say in the last decade or so, that there's been an interesting turn to the archive by poets, by anthropologists, by historians in the African diaspora to what I would say make the archive bear witness in a very uniquely historical and political fashion. And as an educator, I'm really fascinated by that. Why now at this historical moment? And what does it mean for particular visual artists, and even the role of public monuments, public markers, that there's a kind of living, breathing archival project that is underway. And I'm wondering if you can both say a little bit more about why now, but also why the archive.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. I think you're absolutely right that we are kind of discovering this kind of text and these kind of buried narratives that have never really been illuminated, and finding in that the opportunity for political expression and advocacy and education that we haven't kind of historically been able to develop. And I think it is important in our museum in particular. I mean, that's what you're going to see are the kind of the resurrected narratives. We have a slave catalog from 1854 in Montgomery, Alabama, and just reading the descriptions of enslaved people who were being put up for sale gives you an insight into the inhumanity of that institution. We want people to see that. I think on the question of why now, I mean, I've been thinking about that, but when you reflect on it a little bit, when you're enslaved, you have to focus on freedom. And we want our freedom, or we had a little bit more freedom at the end of the 19th century, but then we were being terrorized. And when you're being terrorized, you have to worry about your security, your safety. And then we were migrated into urban ghettos and northern spaces where we were being economically exploited. And when you're being economically exploited and you can't feed your family, you have to focus on how you're going to survive. And in many ways, we're entering really the first period in American history where there are a class of people who have the latitude to begin talking about the things that you have to have a certain measure of comfort and security to talk about. And in many ways, that's why I feel so compelled as the great-grandson of people who were enslaved. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia. My grandmother was forced out of Virginia by terrorism and lynching. My parents were humiliated by segregation. I'm working on this mass incarceration thing, but I feel like I have a little latitude and space to do things that they couldn't do, which is why lifting up those stories, unearthing those archives is so critical to how I want to move forward. I don't want to just keep moving forward as if somehow the past is not relevant to my present. And I think institutionally, culturally, as a people, we're really entering this era where we now have the resources. We're here at Art Basel, right? We're here in spaces where we can do some things that our foreparents couldn't always do. And that's why I think now there is this moment to do work that we have long needed to do, but just didn't have the capacity to kind of pull it together to do. And you have great artists like Charles Gaines and others contributing in this way. It just gives you kind of a power that's been hard to replicate before.
So we have one last question.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, the three of you, for a really powerful morning, and the idea of the hearing about capitalism, and it's at Art Basel is really, the causes of capitalism is right on. But I wanted to just encourage you to talk, because I love the memorial project, and the one aspect that you didn't talk about, which to me is so powerful in dealing with narrative and truth and acknowledgement and moving forward, is the idea of the movement of these pillars to other communities. So I was hoping you would talk about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, first, let me just say to everybody, we're opening the National Memorial on April 26, 2018. Everyone is invited to be with us in Montgomery for the opening of the memorial and the Legacy Museum. I hope you'll come. But yeah, one of the things we're doing, so I mentioned that these 800 plus monuments that make up the memorial represent every county in America where a lynching took place. We do have a replica of each of those monuments in a lawn outside of the memorial structure. And what we're inviting people to do in every community where a lynching took place is to organize and have conversation, and then come to Montgomery, claim your monument, and take it back to your community. Because ultimately, we want this memorial to be born in Montgomery, but we want it to live, we want it to reside, we want it to be seen all over this country. That's the idea of disseminating this experience, this consciousness, not just to the place where we gather in Montgomery, but every community. And that act of activism and communication and reclamation, for me, is a way of fostering a kind of real truth and reconciliation movement in this country that can be led by anyone. People of faith, artists, educators, activists, community leaders. It can be led by anyone who has this kind of desire to see things happen in their community. And I'm very, very excited about that. It'll take years, and our site will become a sort of report card. Because when you come to Montgomery in a few years, you'll see the communities that have claimed their monuments, and you'll see the ones that haven't. And we want to be a constant barometer on where in America there is still resistance to owning up to this history. And we want this memorial to have that kind of dynamism, that kind of relationship to where we are in this country and recovering from this legacy.
We have clearly only scratched the surface, but I think it was a great start. Thank you to Charles and to Bryan for a great conversation, and have a wonderful afternoon.